So welcome to Lecture 10A on the future of international security, and we'll be taking a especially close look at America, China, and the European Union. So we're moving towards a world where America, China, and the European Union each has around 25 to 30% of global GDP. So this means a tripolar world for the most part. But how do these actors convert this economic power into political influence? And what does that mean for the future of international security? So we'll begin with a general overview of these questions. And this can be summarized in terms of 5 main state-centric problems. The first of these is to manage rising powers, particularly China. And here we can consider the idea of a Chinese solution to Chinese and global problems. So as noted in the previous lecture, China has been a great power for around 2,000 years and will continue to be a great power. The US in turn will try to contain it, but will likely fail in these efforts, partly because of the problems of globalization we've discussed throughout this course. In addition, we also have to consider that China itself has many internal political and economic and social problems, again, as we've discussed in Lecture 9b. So China itself will have limits in terms of the way it can project power beyond its own region. So it is highly unlikely that China will be capable of hegemony like the US and the UK practiced over the past 200 years. And we'll come back to this point in the second half of this lecture. A second general problem is the question of managing Russia, which is a great power in decline. Unlike China, Russia's status as a great power lasted only a few decades after World War II, and even then it was limited mainly to military affairs in its own region. However, Russia can still be a spoiler on some critical international security issues, as in the case of Ukraine and Syria, but only if its rivals are heavily divided. And it will continue to maintain some influence over its former Soviet republics. And as we noted in the lectures on interstate war, a Russian military attack against an EU or NATO member state would hopefully provoke a unified and effective response. And again, NATO is already planning for this by forward basing troops and other resources closer to the Baltic republics. Also, defense spending is rising in several EU and NATO member states, as you can see here. So again, this threat hopefully will be dealt with appropriately, but Russia will maintain a major influence in other former Soviet republics, particularly Belarus and Ukraine. Third, as we've seen with many international security problems in these lectures, whether traditional ones or human security issues, they often originate in failed or weak states, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. And these generate a range of security problems, as we've seen in many examples here. So this problem will not go away for the foreseeable future. However, it will be up to major powers, again, particularly America, the European Union, and possibly China, to cope with them. A related problem to the question of failed and weak states is the more general international security problems that are either caused or worsened by globalization, which can be considered an unstoppable or irreversible force. Currently, there's a high degree of unrest around the world in both rich and poor states and in all regions. And you can see from this slide that the number one grievance with many of these protests is the problem of economic justice or austerity measures. So again, it could be theoretically possible to control or reverse globalization by putting up barriers around countries, but this solution is highly unlikely. And the final general problem to be considered is the role of America itself, particularly in terms of its erratic leadership efforts over the past several decades, some of which lead to what can be called a blowback effect of its foreign policies that actually end up doing more harm than good. So in the rest of this half of the lecture, we'll focus on the role of America. So there's no question that America played a hegemonic role since World War II in world politics, but this raises a question of whether that hegemony is in decline and whether America itself actually has some form of grand strategy to help cope with many of the security problems that we've discussed in this course. So the first argument I would like to make is that America is actually pretty bad at the question of grand strategy. And grand strategy itself is predicated on the idea of a national identity or a value system that is supposed to be served by a grand strategy. And here there's clear evidence that America is undergoing a kind of identity crisis, or you could argue a reversion back to its real or substantive identity going back 200 years as an isolationist great power mainly focused on its own problems. And this idea of an isolationist identity goes all the way back to the founding statements of US foreign policy, particularly Washington's farewell address from September 1796, where he outlined 4 core principles of US foreign policy. The first is that the US should take pride in itself as a new and distinct nation, particularly a nation that's not defined by European values. Second, the US should honor its existing agreements and treaties. However, the third principle is that it should be very wary of undertaking new political commitments, particularly permanent military alliances that might draw itself back into European wars. And then fourth, he warned that the US should try to avoid political factions over foreign policy in the form of political parties or ideologies. And of course, this is precisely what happened soon after he left office. So I would argue that the US can be very bad at global leadership for several core reasons related to its national identity. The first, that it's an inherently conservative country. We could even argue that it's puritanical or reactionary in light of its religious and rural tendencies. The second is that there's a high degree of ignorance of international politics and foreign affairs, including about the foreign impact of US policies. And the third general problem is US domestic politics itself, where there are structural barriers, both federal and electoral, as well as cultural barriers to playing an effective global leadership role. And as evidence for some of these points, we can start with America's value system. So most states actually become more liberal and secular or less religious as they develop and get richer. But the US is nearly alone in terms of maintaining traditional or religious attitudes, even though it became richer as a country. And among OECD member states, the richest countries on the world, only Ireland is more religious than the United States is. You can also look at public opinion polling in terms of religious attitudes among the major players. And here you can see that among the G8 countries, the United States is in a class by itself in terms of its citizens thinking that religion isn't important in their daily lives, with over 50% of Americans saying yes to this question. So this can lead to the so-called messianic impulse view of US foreign policy, that it should be a shining example to the rest of the world in terms of its values and its approach to democracy. In terms of ignorance about US foreign policy and world politics, we can see large misperceptions about US foreign aid, just like misperceptions about other things such as immigration, climate change, COVID, and most other issues. And here you can see that most Americans think we spend far too much on foreign aid relative to the actual amount. And some of these misperceptions about foreign policy and international affairs are partly a result of the fact that nearly 2/3 of Americans have never even left their own country. They don't even have a passport, in fact, so they couldn't even leave the country if they wanted to. So the tendency towards ignorance and even isolationism is still very strong in a country that still claims to try to lead the rest of the world on many issues. And taking a look at the Americans who actually travel abroad, these are mostly found on the east and west coasts, particularly the northeast. In the most conservative areas of America, there are very few passport holders relative to the coastal areas. And by 2040, 35 mostly rural states will control roughly 70 out of 100 Senate seats. But 70% of the population lives in the 15 other states. So you can see a huge political and cultural divide here in terms of the willingness to travel and its relationship to political attitudes. And as we know, Trump in particular gained a huge amount of his support from angry, white, and often rural American males found in the interior of the country in particular. But again, Trump is a symptom and not a cause of US instability and isolationism. Many of these political problems are structural in nature because of the US constitutional system, which gives more power to people in rural states relative to more populated and urbanized states like California, which has 40 million people but can send only 2 senators to Congress, whereas 40 million people live in these mostly rural states and they're allowed to send 46 senators to Congress. So this system is increasingly unfair. And of course, it is possible to change the electoral rules through the US constitutional process. However, this is extremely difficult to do in terms of a constitutional amendment because the barriers to change are very high. So again, there have been many proposals and even propose legislative instruments to change these rules, but they never get very far because they are outvoted by mostly Republicans from the conservative rural states. And another consequence of this gap between the rural center and the urban coasts of America is that divided government, meaning that different parties control the presidency or one or both houses of Congress, is now the norm in American politics. And that almost always leads to a gridlock situation where nothing can get done effectively through Congress. In addition to gridlock, divided government generally reduces the power of the president. So as you can see here, through most of US history, going back to the 1800s, party government was the norm. But somewhere around 1980, divided government became more prevalent in US politics. On top of that problem, we can see that there is partisan hatred for the other party among both Democrats and Republicans. So in addition to these domestic, structural, and cultural problems, it's also important to keep in mind that America's post-World War II hegemony was a very rare historical accident, mainly a result of a power vacuum because all of its competitors, including the Soviet Union, most of Europe, and Japan, were completely devastated by the war. So it basically led by default. So in addition to the power vacuum after World War II, there are other factors that are highly unique to America's experience and influence its difficulties in terms of global leadership. And this includes a wealth of natural resources, natural east-west water borders that make invasion difficult, stability on the northern-south flanks, no major peer competitor in the Western Hemisphere since 1898. So the United States is often overly optimistic about itself, even leading to what can be considered a superiority complex. And this results in a high tendency towards a simplification of issues, isolationism, protectionism, and some degree of inconsistency or even hypocrisy, even while claiming moral superiority and being very secure relative to other parts of the world. It's also very easy to frighten average Americans about foreign threats or travel, security problems, or engage in partisan threat inflation for electoral gain. So as a result of all these issues, after World War I, the United States created the League of Nations and then refused to join it because the Senate refused to ratify the treaty. And then after World War II, America created a liberal international order centered around the UN system and then steadily worked to undermine that system. In addition to all of these problems, America itself has been in relative decline against its major competitors, such as the European Union and China, since the 1970s. It does dominate in one area, which is military power. However, as we've seen in this course, military power has its limits, especially in dealing with many new security issues, such as climate change and public health problems. So the US dollar is still the most important world currency, but how long can this last, even without a major international economic crisis of the type we saw in 2008? And how can US dollar hegemony be converted into usable political power, particularly in terms of dealing with security problems? The US dollar is also the main currency for foreign exchange transactions, as you can see here, but other currencies are steadily catching up to it, especially the euro, but also the Japanese yen. But other than currencies catching up to the US dollar, a bigger problem here is that America itself does not have enough foreign exchange reserves or gold reserves to support the dollar in a major crisis. In other words, a global run on the dollar where other countries sell off their supplies of US dollars. As you can see here, among all states in the system, it is China that has the largest amount of foreign exchange reserves. And when you add up all of these problems, it may be that US dollar hegemony eventually ends and will lead to a system based on a dollar block, a euro block, and then other major currencies. So hegemonic currency status does not last forever, at least in terms of previous examples of this going back to the 1400s. Another reason why the US dollar might be running into trouble is the unsustainably high US personal debt burden. And that in turn leads to a volatile electorate, which is often focused on household domestic problems rather than world politics. So you can see the total household debt outstanding has steadily risen, especially since the 1990s. Conversely, the savings as a percent of total personal income in the United States has steadily declined. This also means a steady decline in the US standard of living, despite higher productivity levels. And this was to pay for the war on terror after 2001, and then the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the 2008 economic crisis. In addition to all these other problems, we also see a high degree of inequality in terms of wealth distribution throughout the United States. So this could lead to more political and social instability, and again, a possible turn back towards isolationism. So as a result of all of these problems, the US is still in the bottom third of all rich democracies. So it is hardly a shining example of how to govern itself or how to lead the rest of the world in terms of democratic governance. And again, these problems were well in evidence long before Trump became president in 2017. And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed huge deficiencies in terms of how America governs itself. And it can't lead by example without major reforms. So does this leave an opening for the European Union? So even before Trump was elected and before COVID-19 hit, people were saying that the American dream was already dead or dying because of economic problems and political stability across the entire country. So COVID-19 merely exacerbated all of these problems and exposed how weak America actually is in terms of governing itself. And of course, these domestic problems fed into the international system as well, so that America could not lead even if it wanted to. So hopefully President Biden will do better under these circumstances, but the problem of Trumpism will be around for quite a while. So in turn, how can the European Union itself cope with America's approach to international leadership? Even after Trump leaves, these structural and institutional and political problems will not go away quickly. So this will be the situation to come for at least the next generation or so. So that's it for Lecture 10A, and we'll finish up with Lecture 10B, taking a closer look at the role of China, and finishing with the European Union itself in terms of being a defender of liberal internationalism. So we'll see you then. Okay, welcome to Lecture 10B, our final discussion of this course. And here we'll focus on the role of China and finish with the discussion about the European Union. So coming back to the issue of China, it is highly likely that China will become a regional hegemon and play the dominant role in its neighborhood for the most part. However, there are qualifications to this idea, as we'll see in a few minutes. So the US has tried to dominate geopolitics in the Pacific Ocean as well as East Asia ever since World War II. However, since the Vietnam War, American influence in this region has steadily declined. At the same time, China itself has rising interests on its periphery, and there are numerous hotspots that lead China to favor a stronger role in military and defense affairs, which will inevitably challenge American dominance in these regions. In addition, China does not see these hotspots as isolated problems. It tends to think more strategically about its peripheral security interests and has defined the idea of a first island chain of defense, ranging from the Koreas in the north down to Malaysia and Vietnam in the south, and it intends to control this zone in order to protect its security. And ideally, it would push even further beyond the Philippines to include a second island chain of defense. And a major reason why the Chinese defined security in terms of the first island chain of defense is because it was inspired by America's World War II island hopping strategy, which led to the defeat of Japan. So again, China does not want to be put into this position to allow the United States or any other player to use island hopping as a way to attack China. So as a result of these concerns, among others, Chinese defense spending has been rising slightly, but it is not as much as that of the United States, and it is not likely to overtake America's defense spending, except possibly in the area of army size. However, when adjusted for inflation and for GDP, you can see that Chinese defense spending has been relatively stable over the past 20 to 30 years, averaging around 2% of GDP. America's spending, on the other hand, is currently slightly more than 3% of GDP, but as you can see, it could rise much higher if America wanted to spend more. So China will struggle to spend more than 2 or 3 or 4% of GDP on defense and could invite social unrest if it tries to do so. And taking a look at what the money is actually spent on, you can see from this comparison that the United States is still way ahead of every other country in terms of global power projection. And this is mainly in terms of the Navy, involving its personnel, as well as various types of aircraft carriers, combat aircraft, Marines, and so forth. However, both sides recognize that a land war against China would probably be completely disastrous for both sides eventually. And this is based on experience during the Korean War, when the two sides had to fight each other, as well as the issue of nuclear weapons. So there's always a risk that a US-China war could gradually escalate to the use of nuclear weapons and be a catastrophe for both sides, if not the entire world. However, even if the US and China avoid a large-scale land war in Asia, there are still other opportunities for small-scale military confrontation between the two sides. And these include the issue of Taiwan, where the US maintains a security guarantee, as well as problems in the South China Sea, which also involves the problem of Taiwan. So a central problem in the South China Sea is the issue of the Spratly Islands, where 6 states claim control: China, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, and Taiwan. And a major reason for this dispute is the discovery of more oil and gas resources in the region. So China is trying to assert dominance in the region to control these resources. However, other states, some of which are supported by the US, are likely to push back against it. So there have already been small-scale naval confrontations here, which could escalate into a wider dispute. However, again, it is highly unlikely that this would cause a large-scale US versus China land war in that country. And one problem here has to be seen from the US side. So even though the US 7th Fleet is the world's largest, it has a huge amount of area to cover, with 60 to 70 ships, 300 aircraft, and 40,000 personnel for over 48 million square miles. So again, even if the United States wanted to confront China over many of these disputes around the South China Sea and Taiwan, it is highly unlikely the US could maintain a long-term military confrontation directly against China that would result in its defeat, of the same type that occurred with Japan during World War II. So again, it's highly likely that the two sides will come to some arrangement involving all of these problems, including the issue of Taiwan. However, despite these military limitations, there is some evidence that China will play a much greater role in terms of international economic affairs. And one possibility here is based on the new Belt and Road Initiative. And this could lead to power projection through a massive infrastructure project, or what is called the New Silk Road. And this creates many challenges, but also possible opportunities for other players beyond the United States, such as the European Union. The Belt and Road Initiative has been underway for several years now, and much of it is still in the planning phases. However, as you can see here, it involves a range of high-profile infrastructure projects ranging all the way across Asia, reaching into Western Europe, as well as into sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southern Asia. And these involve railway links, road building, and new ports, oil and gas pipelines, and other possibilities for economic development and Chinese influence. So if this entire project is realized in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, it could make China the dominant economic player, at least in Asia. And to implement the BRI, China is developing a range of links with hundreds of partners throughout Asia, Africa, and even reaching into the Western Hemisphere, including some American firms. So again, this could be a major way for China to project indirectly economic power way beyond its normal sphere of influence. And beyond the Belt and Road Initiative, China is undertaking other projects to enhance its global economic power. And this includes creating a development bank with Brazil, Russia, in India and South Africa. And as you can see, China is the dominant player for the most part within this institution. However, it is highly unlikely to become a global hegemonic role in the way that the United States played after 1945. There's also rising China-India tensions. So India itself is looking more to the US as a partner rather than to China. So again, unless the US itself completely collapses economically and politically, China's hegemonic role will be mainly limited to its own sphere of influence in Asia and possibly sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, China also attempts to act in an opportunistic fashion to assert its global leadership, as it did during the COVID-19 pandemic, when US incompetence reduced its global role, creating a window of opportunity for China to step in. But again, this does not necessarily mean that China can create its own form of global hegemony to replace the role that the US had after 1945. So it will be a major player, but not a global hegemon. So this brings us finally to the role of the European Union. And we'll start by considering the fact that the EU actually has something that could be called a grand strategy involving core elements of physical security, economic prosperity, and value projection. So the three core elements of grand strategy of physical security, economic prosperity, and value projection can be framed in terms of internal, regional, and global objectives. And as you can see here, the EU has considered all of these elements and has specific ideas and policies to promote its grand strategy in various ways. Some of these involve issues such as the single European currency, enlargement policies, collective security arrangements, special attention to less developed countries, as well as opportunistic value projection in the areas of climate change, death penalty, and privacy rights. But the key point is that the EU is doing all of these things to uphold what could be called a grand strategy. Now, taking a closer look at the physical security element of EU grand strategy, again, there are internal, regional, and global components going back to the late 1990s. So in addition to general ideas about physical security, as seen on the previous slides, here there are specific policies pitched at the internal, regional, and global levels in order to uphold European physical security through a grand strategy. And again, some of these elements involve criminal justice measures through the European Court of Justice, the AFSJ, Frontex Europol, the European Centers for Disease Control, and a solidarity clause to respond to terrorist attacks or disasters, while other elements are more military in nature and focused at the regional and global levels, involving, for example, the European External Action Service, the High Representative role, the CSDP and CFSP, as well as various defense arrangements through permanent structured cooperation, the European Defense Agency, regular EU-NATO cooperation, an EU global strategy, and a new European peace facility. In addition, the EU also enjoys 6 specific elements of power resources, ranging from economic power all the way up to heavy military power through air, land, and naval forces. However, the one major thing it lacks in terms of power resources and grand strategy is a nuclear capability. So this is the one missing element that would make the EU a much stronger global military actor. Also, on the more positive side, a majority of Europeans still consistently support the common security and defense policy. on an average of 75% across the entire EU. And this has been the case for years, going back even before the Treaty of Lisbon. And even in the United Kingdom, before it voted to leave, a majority of citizens, over 60%, supported the CSDP. And equally remarkable is the fact that public support for the EU actually rose after Brexit, and even in the United Kingdom, which has voted to leave. So although some EU member states, particularly Greece, still have a somewhat negative view of the EU, Brexit actually caused much stronger support across the entire system for the European Union. And finally, another positive sign is that clear majorities in most EU member states, about 2/3 of them, also support the idea of an EU army, although the planning for such an army is still in the very early stages. However, despite all of these positive trends, the EU is still laboring under the system created by the Treaty of Lisbon about 10 years ago. So I would argue that that treaty is a missed opportunity for the European Union to devise a more coherent, rational, and effective approach to achieving foreign, security, and defense policy cooperation. So the Treaty of Lisbon is very complicated, but the key point is it did not overhaul the entire EU foreign and security policy system into a new coherent framework. And in fact, it builds on previous elements that go all the way back to the 1970s with European political cooperation, followed by a range of other elements that were grafted onto it. So looking at the EU's crisis management system in particular, it is literally a complete mess because there are a range of old and new institutions that claim some degree of responsibility over foreign policy crisis management, and therefore it's never clear exactly who is supposed to take charge when a security crisis faces the European Union. So the centerpiece reform of the Lisbon Treaty was the External Action Service. As you can see here, which seems to be the center of the entire system. But in fact, the External Action Service competes with a range of other important actors, particularly the European Commission, but also powerful EU member states themselves. And these various actors can actually assert control or even prevent the Action Service from planning or undertaking certain activities. So again, the system is not as coherent as the Lisbon Treaty seems to suggest. So just to summarize some of the main problems with the Lisbon Treaty, the first one is that it did not change the streamlined decision-making, and as we've seen, consensus is still the rule, and numerous actors can still speak for the EU. The treaty also intensified a long-standing dispute between the EU's development agenda, run by the Commission, and the security agenda, run by the External Action Service. So it did not dramatically improve the effectiveness or the coherence of the EU's global activities. And since 2010, incremental adjustment has occurred rather than a full-scale reform. Also, since Brexit, France and Germany cannot be expected to continue to lead the system, so other EU member states, particularly Spain, the Nordic countries, Italy, the Netherlands, for example, will have to step up because the smaller micro-states, such as Luxembourg and Malta, cannot be expected to do so, nor can the states with severe domestic political or economic problems. So as you can see here, some EU member states besides France and Germany actually have fairly large standing armies and spend quite a lot of money on defense, relatively speaking. But again, defense spending would have to increase to at least around 3% of GDP across the EU if it is going to undertake more ambitious CSDP operations and try to achieve strategic autonomy. So as a result of these ongoing problems, the EU has not managed to find a coherent and effective response to one of the most important problems in its own neighborhood, and that's the situation in the Arab Spring regions since around 2010. So again, despite the chaos across this entire region involving many states that are part of the European neighborhood policy, there have been no major CSDP actions to help reintroduce stability to most of these states. So again, if the EU cannot control its own southern neighborhood, at least in terms of security policy, there's little chance it could become a strategic, autonomous actor much further afield. And of course, after Trump was elected, a number of EU states, particularly France, began to question NATO and American leadership. And although NATO is not perfect, it still has a purpose to play as long as Russia is considered to be the main threat, not only to the European Union, but also to the transatlantic system as well, involving the US and Canada. And so as long as NATO exists, the EU can play a very strong and important security role towards that institution, at least for the short to medium term future. But again, there is no harm in the EU at least planning to run more autonomous operations in situations where NATO might not be involved. So since the Treaty of Lisbon, the EU has made a number of minor changes to its security policy doctrine in the form of the comprehensive approach and then strategic autonomy, as well as the global strategy and currently the strategic compass. But again, these are all marginal reforms, mainly of a conceptual nature rather than terms of giving the EU a serious capability to solve problems, particularly in its own neighborhood, involving foreign security and defense policy. And as the example of counter-piracy shows, the EU can actually be very effective in terms of implementing a comprehensive or integrated approach to shared security problems. So this was very effective because it actually did reduce the incidences of piracy off the coast of Somalia. So in this case, it did involve a range of short and long-term strategic goals. It had several functional, geographic, and institutional policies to support those goals. It used a range of policy tools, not just the CSDP, but several other ones as well. It involved funding from a range of sources, including EU member states and EU institutions, and it used a range of partners, ranging from the UN to the African Union, NATO, and several others, including in states of the region, to solve this problem. So the comprehensive approach can be a model for future action. And finally, a much bigger question involves the specific EU values that are meant to be secured by the CSDP. So for example, is there such a thing as a European dream, similar to what America thinks about itself? And then who pays to protect these European values? Are they worth killing and dying for? So these questions still have to be considered across the entire system if the European Union is to develop effectively as a coherent strategic actor. And based on numerous rankings of measures of happiness, the quality of life, sustainability, and resilience, EU member states seem to be doing very well. So they must be doing something right in terms of their value system. So how does it protect this value system effectively, and can it export these methods through its foreign and security policy? So we'll return to these questions in the final seminar of this course. So that's it for the lecture portion of this course. I hope you learned a few things, and I'll leave you with a famous quote by Jean Monnet, one of the architects of European integration, who wrote that Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. So he was right about that in the 1950s, and it continues to hold true to this day.
Jo, fertig.